صلوات على صلوات على محمد وآل محمد. We're now going to start the main program with recitation of Quran. صلوات على محمد وآل محمد.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. ألف لام ميم. غلبت الروم في أدنى الأرض وهم من بعد غلبهم سيغلبون في بضع سنين لله الأمر من قبل ومن بعد ويومئذ يفرح المؤمنون بنصر الله ينصر من يشاء وهو العزيز الرحيم. وعد الله لا يخلف الله وعده ولكن أكثر الناس لا يعلمون ظاهرا من الحياة الدنيا وهم عن الآخرة هم غافلون. أولم يتفكروا في أنفسهم ما خلق الله السماوات والأرض وما بينهما إلا بالحق وأجل مسمى وإن كثيرا من الناس بلقاء ربهم لكافرون. أولم يسيروا في الأرض فينظروا كيف كان عاقبة الذين من قبلهم كانوا أشد منهم قوة وأثاروا الأرض وعمروها أكثر مما عمروها وجاءتهم رسلهم بالبينات فما كان الله ليظلمهم ولكن كانوا أنفسهم يظلمون. صدق الله العلي العظيم.
Today we are very fortunate once again to have Shelina Janmohamed, who will be speaking to us on the story of now, why we need to talk about the British Empire. Let's welcome her. Salawat ala Muhammad wa al Muhammad. Shelina, of course, is very well known to all of us. She's a best-selling author of Love in a Headscarf, a memoir about growing up as a British Muslim woman. She also has a book, Generation M, Young Muslims Changing the World, which is an exploration of rising group of global Muslims who believe that faith and modernity go hand in hand. Her debut children's book was The Extraordinary Life of Serena Williams, and now she's published her latest book, Story of Now, Why We Need to Talk About the British Empire, which she'll be speaking about today. She's an established commentator on Muslim and social and religious trends, has written for the Daily Telegraph, The Guardian, The National and the BBC, and is the Vice President of Ogilvy Islamic Marketing, the world's first bespoke global Islamic branding practice for building brands with Muslim audiences. And she was named one of the world's 500 most influential Muslims, and specifically one of the UK's 100 most powerful Muslim women. Salawat ala Muhammad wa al Muhammad.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. It's such a delight to be with all of you to talk about my book. I'm excited to see what you think of it. And also, the children, can you all hear me? Because this is really for you as well. Children are very quiet. My book has just come out a few weeks ago, which I think a lot of you will have seen. And there are so many stories in a book about the British Empire. But the one I wanted us to talk about today is how can telling your own story be a superpower? And hopefully all of you will go home today figuring out that you can find your own superpower and make something of it. So, you ready? Okay, well, if I could make the slides work, then we would be ready. Here we go. So the British Empire is a huge story. You will have seen it dominating all of the news conversations. And as we go through some of our own stories, it's affected our lives in many ways. But one of the things that has really troubled me and found very uncomfortable in the conversations that we have about the British Empire today, certainly in Britain, is that it feels like we're all fighting about the past and what happened in a time gone by. And actually, when it comes to children, and this book is written for children, but actually for all of us, what I was much more interested in is telling the story of who we are today, the story of now, and what we can learn from what has happened in the past to shape the kinds of lives we have today and where we want to go in the future. And that's why the book is called The Story of Now, rather than being anything about the past. Now, my own journey to write about the British Empire started with this gentleman in 2020. Do you guys know who he is? By the way, it's going to be a little bit interactive, so I hope you guys have drunk some coffee or something before you came. Anyone know who this is? First options always go to the children, although I can't see them. Who is this guy? Yeah. Oh, Iman. I don't know if Iman counts. He's a slave trader. Do you know his name? You can shout it out because I can't see the hands. This, if you think back to 2020, is a person called Edward Colston. And you might remember that in 2020, after the murder of George Floyd, and when we had the rise of the anti-racism riots, his statue became extremely controversial in Bristol, and there was a riot about bringing it down. So who was Edward Colston? Which, to be honest, in 2020, and I know I've written an entire book about the British Empire, but in 2020 I had absolutely no idea who Edward Colston was. And that was really the start of my own journey to understand this story. So he lived from 1636 to 1721, so quite a long time ago, and he became wealthy from trading enslaved people. Thank you, Iman. And he's estimated to have traded around 100,000 slaves, and of which another 20,000 are thought to have died in the Middle Passage, which was the journey between the UK and North America at the time. This statue, though, that went on to become so controversial, was not in fact erected in his lifetime. It was erected right at the end of the 19th century by the Victorians. And the reason that they erected it was they wanted to project this kind of successful, dominating, pioneering, wealthy idea of what Britain was. And the 19th century was really the back end of the British Empire. It was a time when the British Empire was ruling the world, and it needed to justify its reasons for doing so. It was also interesting, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, a time of great tumultuousness in Britain itself, as people were going through the after effects of the Industrial Revolution. There were riots, there was a labour movement, and those in power wanted to project this image of Britain being a very strong, powerful country. And that's why the statue of Edward Colston was put up. It was nothing to do with celebrating him at the time. And in 2020, the past was remembered again, and people came to discuss, what was this figure, Edward Colston? Why should he be in our public space? And was he somebody that represents who we are today? Now, one of the things that we hear in our conversations is a big fight, these kind of culture wars that are very intense about what should we do with these statues, for example, or lots of other symbols that we have. And there are different views about whether we should leave them up, whether we should add little things on their statues to explain who they were, give a bit more context, whether they should be taken down and put into museums and treated as art objects, and then their history discussed. So it's a hugely controversial issue, as you might have seen. But for me, it was interesting about why we were having this conversation about this person who, to be honest, I wasn't the only person who hadn't heard of them. I mean, if you want, you can put your hands up if you hadn't heard of him either. Most of the country had no clue who Edward Colston was, and yet here we were having this great national emotional debate about him. Now, while that was going on, I came across another story. So we are in the locality of Wembley. It's just down the road, about 5 or 10 minutes away. So let me ask you this question. What was in Wembley before Wembley Stadium? How much do we know about our own local history? If you've read the book, I might give you a bit of leeway to maybe just hold on to it. Do you know the answer? Wembley Arena? Wembley Arena? Not quite. Before that, yep. Britain and slavery. You're right about the Britain bit. You definitely got halfway there. We like that. So, what was in Wembley before Wembley Stadium? And one of the things that I think it's really important to think about is the locality we live in. What is the place we live in? What does it tell us? The street names, the buildings, the history of it. Well, I don't know if that was before or after Wembley Stadium. So there is an industrial estate there. Any other final answers? So, what was before Wembley Stadium? In 1923, the British Empire exhibition was actually held on the site we have Wembley Stadium at the moment, and there was a football match there. I don't know anything about football, but those of you who do will remember it. And it was actually constructed, this huge festival, which lasted a whole year in order to generate excitement amongst the British public about this vast, great thing that was the British Empire. And it had pavilions from all around the world. And as you can see from the picture, I don't know if it's coming through, it has almost like a Mughal feel to it, and there were buildings that were done in the Mughal style. If you go to Wembley today, if you've driven around that area, you might remember there's a road called Empire Way. Well, that's the reason, because they had the British Empire exhibition at the time. So you can see this huge site, which was about celebrating the great pomp of the British Empire, except this was completely knocked down. And nobody batted an eyelid. There are some parks nearby where you can see bits of the Empire Exhibition building. So what happened to Edward Colston? Well, as you know, the statue was toppled. It went into the sea. They brought it back, and you can just about see on the photo that there is some graffiti. And so that was what happened to his to that statue and the controversy about him. What happened to Wembley Stadium? Well, does this look familiar to you guys? Yeah? Does anyone know where it is? Yeah, it's the A40. It's called North Haller Field. So when they dug up the British Empire exhibition and later they put the new Wembley Stadium, they unearthed lots of earth and they had to put it somewhere. And so they created these 4 hills in North Haller Field. So that is also part of the British Empire. And so the question for me, so partly, if you ever go to North Haller Fields now, you'll know where all the earth came from. Very nice construction. But when it comes to the British Empire and the stories that are told, this is what I was thinking about when I was looking at these 2 stories. Why do some stories matter more than other stories? Like, why are they giving prominence? What happens when your story is missing from that bigger story that's told? Who is the conversation for? So if we think about, why was Colston such a polemical figure? Why did his statue generate so much heat in the conversation? Who should be in this conversation? So for example, when we talk about decolonizing the curriculum, or we talk about, trying to bring new stories, is it only for people who were from the colonized countries? If I may put it really bluntly, is it for just brown and black people to have this conversation? Who is the conversation about the British Empire for? But most importantly, when we are having those conversations, how do we have really great conversations? Because it seems to me that we are stuck in not having good conversations and stuck in these very heated culture wars. And so how do you make sure that when we talk about today and what the country should be and the communities we have and the societies we are part of and how we build them to be better, we are not arguing about a past and stuck about what did or didn't happen in the past. We're talking about what happens now, because that's really important for all of us, but particularly for children. For children, they want us to look ahead with them and see what's coming, not get stuck in some kind of past. And so if you've seen any of the information about the book, I say this is not a history book. This is the story of now. In fact, I am not actually a historian, and I come at this story because I'm interested in who we are, what makes us, how do we take a share of the cultural capital? So in all of the policies, in all of the social narratives that we have, in all of the ways that we are treated in our day-to-day lives, that's all shaped by the stories. And And what I wanted to show you is that this is something that's really preoccupied me for about 20 years of my career, which is I work in advertising. Advertising is about how do you shape culture through the stories you tell about brands and the way that businesses shape our culture. If you think about all of the jingles in our heads, in the adverts you remember and the products you use, this is about how we shape our culture and the ideas about it. When we write about newspapers, this is again, shaping culture and opinion. That's why it's so important to have people from all communities in these places which are setting the stories, because they shape our ideas about who gets to have power, who gets to shape our society, who actually gets a place in it, and more recently around publishing as well. So I come at this as somebody who's really interested in who are we, what is our place in society, and how do we create better societies? I'm not coming at this from an academic or a historian point of view, which is also a very coded way of saying, please don't ask me any difficult history questions later. So, when I set out on this journey, and this is let's see how well you guys do. What do you really know about the biggest empire ever? And that's one of the things that really astounded me. When I started in 2020, after the fall of Colston, I wanted to find something for children to read. There was nothing for children to read. And I just absolutely couldn't believe it, because the British Empire was the biggest empire ever. And that is an absolute fact. The biggest empire ever in history, and yet we don't have things that can help us understand its context today. So let's do a little quiz, see how you guys get on. So, when did the British Empire start? You can shout out or raise your hands. When did it start? In 1498. Some people say that. Are you talking about Henry VII? And was that the British Empire? Portuguese, maybe? All right, any other answers? I didn't realize we'd get into controversy so early. Any other answers? When did the British Empire start? Yes. 1568. What makes you think 1568? Okay, so we've got an answer from a lovely young man here. He's saying 1568, after Henry, kind of Queen Elizabeth. Okay, any others? So look, I've already only asked you one question. So there are lots of different ideas about when the British Empire started. Some people say it's when Henry VIII declared England to be an empire in what some people now describe as the first Brexit from Europe, when he broke away from the Pope and the Catholic Europe. Having said that, England was quite a lonely little country then, and it was quite poor. So maybe when Henry VIII was saying he thought England was an empire, that was a bit of a kind of grandiose statement that he was making, or perhaps aspiration. Some people say that when England first went into Ireland and started to try and colonize Ireland, that was really the beginnings of its empire. But there's actually no official start date in that sense for the British Empire. So we're already in the place where, we're talking about something that went on for a long time, but, it doesn't have a beginning. How old is Britain as a country? It's not supposed to be this difficult, is it? Magna Carta. Okay, that's an interesting answer. Maybe. Yes? The Celts. William the Conqueror. Everyone's really digging deep into their history now, aren't they? Trying to remember what their kids have been learning. How old is Britain as a country? Well, it was actually England when it started on these colonial adventures, and it wasn't really until 1707, when there was an Act of Union of England, Wales and Scotland, that we get the United Kingdom of Great Britain. Later, Ireland was added, United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and then back to Northern Ireland. So Britain, bit of a trick question, sorry, 1707. When did it become an empire? Yes.
When Queen Victoria became Empress of India?
Excellent answer. When Queen Victoria became Empress of India. Does anyone know what year that was? It is 1877. This is a bit nearer our time. And finally, when did the British Empire end? I'm liking this. Have you guys read the book? Is this like a bit of cheating? 1970, 1980. Any other answers? 1945, which is not when India got its independence. 47, okay. I'm looking to the ladies to help me here. The answer is, well, some people say it's 1997 when Hong Kong was handed back to the Chinese, although other people would question whether it still ended, given our monarch is still the head of state of 14 territories. Don't know how long that's going to last. And of course, we have the Commonwealth and the informal empire. So already you start to see that there are so many just basic facts that we don't even really have in the conversation as a country about, you know, what shaped the British Empire, which of course shapes what Britain is today. If you had been a child 100 years ago, this is the map you probably would have been shown about the British Empire, and it's famously, it's only in black and white here, sorry, but it's famously called the pink map because the bits that the British Empire had ruled over in totality were in pink. Do you know how many people it ruled over at its peak, which was about 100 years ago? A third of the world, very close. It was 412 million people and 25% of the world's landmass. And when I was looking at this map, one of the things that I really wanted to think about is how our stories, you know, are reflected in this map. And I think for many people in this room, this might resonate as well. The stories of where we have come from, how the British Empire has shaped who we are. So, you know, starting in India, in Gujarat, coming to East Africa, and then coming to the UK. Do you know when the East India Company first arrived in Surat, which was its first stop? I feel like I should have sent a note in advance going, come ready. Earlier than 1700. You're in the right century now, not 1640. It was 1608 that the East India Company first arrived in Surat in Gujarat. So maybe our great-great-great-great-great-grandparents were one of those who either were receiving them or were like, who are these people? So that's a little bit about the approach that I think is so important for us to start taking when we're thinking about the world that has shaped us and how we've come to be who we are. But what I really want to talk about today is the power of stories. Like I told you, the story of Colston and the story of Wembley Stadium. Stories are extremely powerful because they shape the world we live in, and they shape who gets to have power in the world that we live in and to have influence and to live their best lives. So the power of stories and who gets to tell them is what I want to concentrate on. So this might look familiar to some of you, and I'm not sure if I need to ask permission or forgiveness, but I've taken this from the Salam Centre website, which, by the way, just as a pitch, if you haven't gone to have a look, go around, have a look, make a donation. But I wanted to just tell a kind of apocryphal story here. So imagine this is your family, your community, the people you live amongst. And this is a picture that, you know, is on the website and tells a story about a particular community. What happens if somebody tears some of that photograph away and those people just simply disappear from the narrative of this community? In 5 years' time, you might remember who they are. In 10, 50, 100, 1,000 years, their stories will be completely erased and they will not be part of that history. How that feels to be torn away and out and missing from the story, that is what has happened with the stories of the British Empire. It's just like if you have a phone and you crop a photo out, or you've taken it, if you missed it, you're going to forget that those people are there. You won't know what the contribution will be. And so stories become powerful because if you're torn out, you're erased, you're cropped, nobody will know who you are, what your story is, or what your contribution is. And for the descendants of those people, they will also not know what their backstory is. And that's a loss for everybody. And that's where we are with the story of the British Empire today. My apologies to the people who were in the example photo ripped out. And stories are very, very powerful. They are a kind of superpower. And sometimes we are raised not to tell our stories, to be told that we should withdraw. It's a little bit perhaps bold, perhaps even arrogant to tell our stories. But stories have power, and they need to be told, because if we don't want to be torn out of that picture, if we don't want our stories to be erased, we are the ones who have to capture them. Nobody will capture those stories for us. Now, you guys might be familiar with the story of Olaudah Equiano. Has anyone heard of him? I like the kids have. I'm a bit worried about the grown-ups here. So he wrote the first and possibly the most famous of all narratives about the experience of being an enslaved person, called The Interesting Narrative of the Life of Olaudah Equiano, and it was published in 1789. And he escaped from slavery. He was freed. He had a very interesting life, which is worth reading about. But it was when people read his memoir that they truly began to understand what the experience was of an enslaved person. He became a leading abolitionist, and his story became a bestseller. And it was the power of him telling his own story that started to change people's minds. So when you know somebody's story, it has an impact. What about this question? Anyone know what polishing your shoes has to do with slavery? Any, Iman? Iman doesn't know. Do you know? So you're on the right track. So the young gentleman here has said the ingredients would come from the work, the toil of enslaved people. So it was the sugar. There was actually sugar that was in shoe polish. And this came to the attention of children. So this image here, this is a book that was written for children in the period of slavery, and it's called The Black Man's Lament, or How to Make Sugar. And there was a drive. People at the time knew that slavery was wrong and that people were being treated badly. And these books were printed for children, and the children themselves engaged in a sugar boycott. And part of that is there's a story of a little boy who stopped polishing his shoes because it had sugar in it. And so children, for all the children listening, children can have such a powerful impact by understanding the power they have. And a lot of the children who were part of the sugar boycott then went on to become part of the abolitionist movement. So children have that power, and the stories we tell them also have that power. And now this is... So I can't see this going on here. So that's one of the stories that we have from the children using their voices and their power to change the way that the country was run. Another story here. So you all have heard of the Industrial Revolution. By the way, I'm just giving you kind of little snippets. There's a lot more stories in the book. I just wanted to tell a narrative of why stories are so powerful. So the Industrial Revolution, as you know, was transformative in global history, and in particular for the UK. The UK became known as the workshop of the world. And this is where a huge amount of wealth was generated because of that manufacturing process and the way that we had this paradigm shift from the manual economy into the industrialized economy. As an aside, and just hold this thought, some people say that as we go into this new era of, digital space and AI, are we about to go into a new kind of paradigm in the same way? And there's a reason that I'm flagging that out of interest. But during the Industrial Revolution, all the resources of the world would come to Britain, and Britain then used its manufacturing expertise to increase its wealth. There's a whole different story about wealth and inequality and how that was generated. But children were actually employed as labor within the factories. And the industrialists, this is really interesting, they would say we can't use adult labor because it's too expensive, and we can hear echoes of that today. Such and such labor is too expensive. If we have more than minimum wage, it's too expensive. We can't make money. So they argued that we need to have children in order to work cheaply and to do the really difficult, dangerous work if we're going to make profits. But of course, this was terrible, terrible conditions for the children as they worked. Parliament then commissioned a report, and they collected the testimony of children And those children were incredibly brave, and they spoke up about the treatment that they had, and that was actually compiled into a commission, and that was used to change children's labour laws today. So our children who go to school and don't work, they can track their roots to that, back to the stories and the voices of children who were really brave. And that's why telling your story matters so much, and why it's so important for all the children who are listening, that if somebody asks your opinion or your story, you should share it with them, because you can change a whole country and the lives of children for hundreds of years after you. There's a story about where we have lots of striking, lots of trade union movement at the moment, lots of protesting for pay. At the end of the 19th century, in 1888, there was something called the match girls strike. So match girls used to create matches, as the name suggests, and they would dip the sticks into phosphorus, which is a poisonous product, as you know. And they would be trapped in these rooms for 12 to 14 hours, just dipping sticks into phosphorus. And they would develop something called phossy jaw, which is basically they would get a cancer of their jaw and their jaws would completely deteriorate. And they were locked in these rooms and they would be penalized if they didn't work hard enough. And some of these girls were as young as 13 years old. And they decided to actually protest. They conducted a strike. And after 16 days, their conditions were improved. The employers actually relented. And their strike inspired the dock workers' strike, and that went on later to form the Labour Party that we know today. That was the foundation of it. And again, these are girls, these are children who are using their stories, using their power to create change. And that's what children and all of us can do with our stories. The empire affected children in unexpected and really quite gruesome ways. So these, I've got little snippets here. These are actually adverts in the UK for children who were for sale. These were enslaved children in the UK that were being sold, and I've expanded them here so you can see a little bit. For example, a handsome black boy, about 13 years of age, very well qualified for making a household servant, serving a table well, and so on. So children were actually being sold as part of the empire in Britain itself, and collecting these stories. So looking at one of the things I wanted to show the audience, and particularly the children, is looking at this original evidence is so powerful, but also tells us how important it is for us to keep our own evidence and keep our records and archive them so they can be then reviewed later by people who come afterwards. There's the story of the home children. Has anyone heard of this? You know, in the way that the empire affected children? Has anyone come across this story? So this is between the 1860s and the middle of last century. There are still children, still adults alive today who were part of this policy, who were sent away from Britain to different parts of the empire, and they were called the home children. So around 150,000. You can follow their stories still in Canada and Australia. There was a view that they were having terrible lives in Britain, and there was a lot of poverty, and you know there was a difficulty for them. But sometimes they were sent away to families where they were not allowed to talk about where they had come from. And they were treated in those colonial families, the British colonial families in places like Canada and Australia. And they were considered as immigrants. And they were told to stop talking about their origins, and they would be treated very badly. And partly this is a huge scandal that we don't talk about in terms of the way the British Empire treated British children who were sent abroad. But partly, one of the things that's really important for us to think about is, what does it mean to be a migrant, and how do those stories get told today? And this is a picture of some of those home children. Now, one of the stories that I came across, which I really was an absolute eye-opener for me, and actually might start to resonate with people here, is the story of indentured servitude. So as everybody will be familiar, because we hear about it non-stop in the news, slavery was abolished. The trade was abolished in 1807, and then slavery itself as a status was abolished in 1833 and then enacted in 1834. But in 1834, there were still lots of plantations around the world. The British Empire was still very much at its height, and it couldn't have free labor anymore. But it wanted to make money, so what did it do? And I'll give you a little bit of homework to go away and do. So the PM at the time was Gladstone, and his father was, big in plantations, and he needed cheap labor. So they created something called indentured servitude. And essentially what indentured servitude was, that people would sign a contract that they would go overseas, usually from India or China, Southeast Asia, but majority were from India, so people that might have been related to us. And in exchange for paying off the transport on the ship and the food and the lodging, and as you can imagine, unscrupulous employers would then add costs onto that, they would have to work for a contracted number of years to pay that back. That typically got extended, or it was just too expensive to go back home. And so they were, for all intents and purposes, slaves. Not in the same chattel slavery, but these indentured servants went from India, and might explain why you've had some of the stories about why there are Indian communities in different parts of the world. Some of them actually went to South Africa and East Africa, and may have explained the big movement that was going on there. And it's today why you might see Indians in lots of very unexpected parts of the world. One of them that I caught, which I thought was really fascinating, was in Fiji. There are Indians. So this is a story you can look up. And they came to cut sugarcane. So on the previous picture, especially for the children, if you haven't seen it, that's what sugarcane looks like. And they actually traveled around the world, and they still have Indian communities there that do that work. I thought this might be a nice picture for us to have a look at, as many people here might be from East African origin. So this is actually a picture from the turn of the 20th century of the workers who were laying the railways as the British arrived in East Africa and wanted to go into the interior. Again, these photos are really powerful stories. And I've got a little spotlight here. When you go through the book, there's little spotlights on all of the different regions. So that's just a starter of, if we don't know those stories, how can we possibly understand who we are, but also the world that we live in and how it's come to be? But what's really interesting for me is that history stories are important. They give us a sense of where we've come from, how the world has been shaped. But history isn't just about the past. The stories are for understanding the world we live in now, and especially how we shape our future. So these are some questions that I pose in the book to think about, or to try and make this story a little bit more engaging. So, should companies run countries have armies and their own currency? Can you guess which company I might be talking about? East India Company. So the East India Company, as you might know, ran India until it messed up, and then the British government had to step in, which begs the question, what should be the relationship between a big corporation and the government? It's a question that we face now. The East India Company had its own army. That's why it could fight a war. Should a company have its own army? The East India Company even had its own currency, which it used. So it's an interesting question about the East India Company. But how many companies do you know now that are bigger than countries? So we have huge companies now that command greater finances than... Oh, do you want to make a suggestion? Maybe Amazon, yeah. I'm not affiliated to any of the companies. I'm not being negative or positive about them. We all know there are lots of companies that have greater economic power than a lot of other countries. And some of them have their own currency. There's been speculation about, digital and cryptocurrencies that certain companies have. So the question about whether the East India Company should have run its own country and had its own currency is one that feels particularly pertinent to where we are today, as we start to see that companies have that kind of power and that kind of reach. What can we learn from Sir Francis Drake about living on Mars? I have to say, I'm always a bit reluctant to say we can learn anything from Sir Francis Drake, because he was a rather unsavoury character. But, this is one of the questions that I think comes from the story of the British Empire. So the British Empire and lots of other empires, particularly in this era that we're talking about, the 17, 18, 1900s, Age of Discovery, European colonialism, were really about going out into the world and claiming the world as though it belonged to them. I mean, one of the things that always I just am gobsmacked by is when you read about things like the Treaty of Versailles and the way that Africa was carved up between the European powers, and the British and the German would be like, well, I'll have that bit and you'll have that bit, and you're like, but there are people who already live there. And so the way that colonialism rolled out, the impact it had on the natural habitat. Well, we're about to go into space. We're going into galactic space. What can we learn from the way that imperialism and colonialism was conducted about when we go into this new era of, galactic imperialism? Or I was talking about, digital space earlier and AI, and we've got a whole paradigm shift. Well, if we go into cyberspace, who owns that real estate? How is it colonized? Do we get a space in it? Who owns that area? Who does it already belong to? So when there are things we can learn from how colonialism and imperialism did or did not succeed, depending on where you stand on that, about how we go into these new kind of spaces and whether there should be imperialism or not. How British is the Great British Cuppa? I bet you're all hoping that we're getting to the tea quite soon. Well, one of the most unbelievable stories of the British Empire is how tea and sugar became these huge, widespread commodities. And it was this kind of almost partnership of the two that spurred on having both. And the more you got, the cheaper they became, and you could then access them. And so there is an argument that says that tea and sugar and all the other commodities, chocolate as well, by the way, in case you're interested, they became affordable for people. And what's wrong with being affordable? But what's the price to pay for that? So when we talk about Britishness and the British icons, how were they created? Was there a role for the opium wars and the drug dealing that the British Empire engaged in, and the way that they totally transformed all of the landscapes to grow tea? And we have the impact of that today on climate change. So how British is the Great British Cuppa? And just one I wanted to throw in, given we've got, there's a little bit of things happening in the news. So you might have been following the story of France and the abaya ban and the long backdrop of the hijab bans they have there, but also the wider conversations about Muslim women and hijab and freedom. So I thought this was a really interesting example for us to think about. When we know what's happened in the past, does it help us to make sense of narratives that are happening today and in the future? So Lord Cromer was the British consul over Egypt at the end of the 18th and the early 19th century. And Egypt, as you know, has lots of Muslims in it, including Muslim women who cover, and certainly would have covered at that time. And he decided that Muslim women would be free if they didn't cover. And so he was trying to advocate for the removal of Muslim women's hijab, and you'll know the stories in other parts of the Middle East as well. And he said this was to modernize and to bring Muslim women the kind of liberation and freedom that he felt they should have. When he came back to the UK in 1910, honestly, the gall of the man is quite shocking. When he came back in 1910, and you remember, that was the era of the protests for women's suffrage, for women to get the vote, which came in 1920. In 1910, he founded the Men's League for Opposition to Women's Suffrage. And so you can see that there is what we might call a disparity, double standard, in the way this conversation was being had about who should have power and whose stories are important. And it's such a great example of why knowing a past story helps to make sense of the stories that we're in now, and helps us to advocate for the power and the stories we want to have in the future. Because you can see what's happening, but you also see why knowing your story is so important and so powerful. And there's lots of other stories. So, children may want to go away and investigate what can voodoo and pajamas tell us about Britain today. One question perhaps for the philosophers amongst you: would you steal from another country because of a health pandemic? So again, learning from our past. And to this, I would suggest you go away and have a look at the story of quinine, which is the most unbelievable story about a tree from Peru where you ate the bark, which was stolen by the British, spread around the world, and stopped people getting malaria so that the empire could spread, was turned into tonic water. So if you've ever drunk tonic water, you can thank the British who stole the saplings from the Peruvians. But it stopped people getting malaria. Okay, some of them, it stopped them getting malaria so they could set up the British Empire and colonize everybody, but some of them, it actually saved them from getting malaria. So it's a complex story. Well, for children and for us, we've just lived through a health pandemic. How does this story help us understand the good and how we can beat a future health pandemic without doing all the kind of dodgy things that ought not to have happened? What about the sound of home? What does the sound of home sound like? So in 1932, the BBC set up the Empire Service so that all the people in the far-flung colonies could, who were from Britain, could feel a sense of home. Well, what does home mean? How many times have we been told to go back home? Or where are you really from? So these are kind of interesting questions about, can you create a new sound of home? What does that sound like when you have people from different homes? And what are the voices for that? And that affects not just people from the colonized countries. Remember that the BBC had a very specific sound to it. You had to have received pronunciation. You had to have the Queen's English. Even if you were from one of the regions, you couldn't be the sound of Britain. So these are really interesting stories to go away and think about how they affect our world today. So your story matters. That's what I've been trying to tell you. The stories of the past are not just an academic pursuit. They shape everything about the world that we live in today and how we then develop the world and how we play our part in our communities. Because only by understanding them can we understand where we are and our role to play in it. So our stories matter. So, do you remember this picture, which I asked forgiveness for sharing earlier? You can still donate. There are buttons around if you want them. And if you remember, we were worried about losing some of these stories. Stories that could be torn away, edited out, erased, or simply never captured. And some of those stories are oral stories. Some of them have never been captured because they are not considered the kind of grand stories of the world. They're not stories of kings and queens and politicians or army generals. But one of the things that I really want to impress on all of us, and I tell children in the book, is that the oral stories that we have in our families are the most exciting kind of stories of all, because they are the stories that have shaped who we are, and they are the stories that have not been captured so far. And those are the stories that we want to make sure shape who we are, but are also captured and given to those who are coming around us and after us. And we need to start collecting those oral stories now. And that is for community needs. We need that to understand who we are as communities and how we interact with those around us. But some of them are also about individual and family stories. And I realize some of the writing might be small. It's all in the book, and there's an activity sheet that you can have as well. So one of the things I realized and that I feel really passionate about is that it's so important for us to sit with the elder members of our families and for the elder members to sit with the children to share those stories and to be able to relate the lives and the experiences, because that's not in books and we need to start capturing that. But that can be hard. I get it. You're in your day-to-day life, you're doing the school run, you've gone for a meal. Like, who has time to go, come on, Grandma, tell me your story? So there are some ways that can make that really interesting and engaging. And also, if you are a grandparent, it's quite therapeutic as well, telling your story to kids. So, here are some examples of just easy ways to start those conversations. So a child could ask an elder of the family, or the elder could volunteer, when and where were you born? One of the things I discovered when I was writing the book is I was doing the acknowledgements and I wanted to acknowledge my great-grandparents. And do you know what? Nobody could find their names. Like, we just didn't know what the names. It was just like, you know, Dadi or, you know, a kind of, you know, people didn't really know, especially the women. I have to say, the women, very difficult to find their names. So please go away and find them. So when and where were you born? Who is the oldest member of the family that you remember? What were the names of their parents? Write those names down. What school did you go to? What was it like? What were your favorite lessons? And so on. These are really easy prompts to start capturing those stories. Do you have a question? Yes.
What happens if we mix our stories and there was like a book of published? So let's say so you have a group of people in the community. Each one is from a different country. There are as many people as there are countries. Each one represents. If each one published a book, then send the book round, mixing the story in, what would happen?
So the question, if I've understood it, which is excellent, and I might need help to make sure I've got it right, is that you have a community and the community has lots of people and they are from many different countries. Each of them writes their own story. I wasn't clear if they write their own story in their own book or they all write a chapter in one book and then you put them together. They each write a book. We will need a publishing house to do this. I like this. This is thinking big. Okay, I don't know. Oh, we have a volunteer for the publishing house in the back. There we go. So you get a whole library of books of stories. I love it. This is a good outcome for this session.
What happens if you mix those, as in kind of put those stories?
So you kind of see how so the question is, what happens if you mix the stories? So you're saying you see how they intersect and they fit together?
As in, not fitting, but forming them together.
So you would need one overall editor to kind of weave it together into a big story. Shall we come back to your question at the end? Because I'm not sure either of us quite know where you're going. But I do like the idea that we're going to have lots of stories. And there are, you know what? You should go round at the end and just make sure everybody writes their story. I like this. So that's the power of individual and family stories. And I can't really stress enough how important it is we start collecting these stories. Because there's so much to learn from within us that we need to capture it before it's lost. But when you know your story, that's when you can start to talk to other people. And really at the beginning, I was talking about my own frustration at the kinds of dead-end conversations we end up in when we talk about the British Empire and we talk about the past. Because the past is really to help us to shape the future, as I've demonstrated in some of the stories and provocations earlier. But when you know your story, you can have really great conversations with other people who might be different to you and have different experiences because you understand who you are and what's shaped you and how you've come to be the person you are, but so does the other person. And I've put examples of 2 stories from literally the last week in the UK talking about slavery, which is a very hot topic. But it just goes to show how differently a country's conversation, a community's conversation can go when people know their story and are able to articulate and have a conversation. So we had the story of one former Tory MP, and she was part of a Cambridge PhD student, a black man, who was researching his own story of slavery and being from an enslaved family. And this lady, Antoinette Sandbach, she actually asked for her name to be removed from it. So she didn't want her story to be articulated. And that, to me, talks about somebody who doesn't really know their own story and understand how it's been shaped. On the other hand, we had a story of David Harewood, the famous actor who you might have heard of, and the Earl of Harewood. And David Harewood says when he went to that huge stately home, he didn't realise that there was a relationship between him. His family took the name of their slave owners. But the Earl of Harewood has said that, you know, being honest about the past is the only way to start to address the prejudices of the present. And he's now commissioned a portrait of David Harewood to sit amongst those that are in the stately home. And these are such great examples of when you know your story and you can assert your story. You can have good conversations, and you can assert power in society and shape it for the future. So, I hope I've tried to talk about why knowing our stories is so important, knowing not just the past but our own stories today. And I hope that you will take some of these and start to build your own stories. We've got two volunteers to capture your stories and turn it into a book. So, a little gift to go on your way. What's the best biscuit to start that conversation that you're going to have? And I'll give you a couple of little snippets. You can tell me your answers later. So did you know until the British Empire created enough cheap sugar, biscuits were actually savoury? It was only when there was enough cheap sugar that biscuits became sweet. But also, if you like a chocolate digestive, or you like your biscuits dipped in chocolate, we can also thank the British Empire for that chocolate, because that's how it was created at scale. And today we have companies like Cadbury's and Fry's and Rowntree that have their roots in the British Empire. And they have some really interesting ways that they did business as well at that time. So when you're having your biscuit with your Great British Cuppa, think about how the British Empire has led you to be able to have those two delicacies. If you want a copy of the book, there's a QR code for you there. So, how can telling your own story be a superpower? Well, finding your story isn't about the history or the past. Finding your story is one of the greatest gifts you can give to yourself and to your children. And knowing your story means you being able to have good conversations, and that contributes to society. And being part of shaping the story of now is one of the greatest gifts we can give to ourselves and to the societies we are part of. Thank you. Wassalamu alaikum.
Thank you very much. We do have some time for questions. If there are any questions from either side, come back.
Shelina, thank you very much. I think there is one thing which shocked me actually when I came across it. As you mentioned about the abolition of slavery, which was a few years after the end of slavery in that sense, because they had to pay compensation to people who owned slaves. And a lot of this wealth which we see is from that compensation. You've seen this Levelian and others saying we should give back. The thing which is important behind that is that just like now you own shares or bonds, people used to own slaves as a source of income and their pension. So everybody had, say, I'm having 3 slaves so that I can have a good pension, and I have 2 slaves. So you can see the sense in society that this was the right thing to do, to own slaves, and we had to pay each one of them compensation for freeing the slaves. This adds to your narrative of how it became entrenched in society.
Yeah, I think so. For those who didn't hear the question, Iqbal Uncle was talking about how normalized it was for people to own slaves, and actually it was considered part of your investment and your pension. And actually one of the things I talk about in the book is we look back at slavery and we say, oh my God, how could people do that? It was horrendous. But then I set ourselves the challenge, which is what are people in 100 or 200 or 500 years going to look back at us and say, oh my God, can't believe those people used to do that. And, you know, really obvious things immediately are, of course, modern slavery, human trafficking, but there are much less obvious things. So child labor. I mean, I'm talking as somebody who's in, you know, kind of in the culpability of this, but I think it's a really important point about how do we learn from that experience that, you know, ordinary people owned enslaved people. You know, if you look at the UCL database of the slave owners that were given compensation on the day that slavery was abolished, so there's a record that has the name of every single person who was given compensation. So on that date in 1834, we know who they all were. there were ordinary people amongst them. And so what are we going to find ourselves doing that actually, if we looked back, we were like, we should not have been doing that? And I think that's a really great prompt for us.
Yes, I just want to pick up on the last point you made about stories to help yourselves. So I'm a big advocate for Black History Month. And what I realize is that those individual youngsters that have come from the Afro-Caribbean community, behavior patterns change when they know where they come from. Yeah, they feel an inner strength, and hence it improves. So I can actually see that at events where people learn about their history, and basically what happens is that they feel that they're of some value. Yeah, so it's a very apt point that you made, that telling your story, equally with our communities, we know where we come from, it strengthens our bond as well, right? So that's basically what I wanted to say.
No, that's it's a really important point about how it gives you strength, confidence, and allows you almost a freedom to be yourself when you know what your story is. I just wanted to build on that, on a point that I think is really important. So I talked earlier about how often the story of the British Empire is seen as a story for the colonized, or the people from, those countries that were part of the empire, particularly who have come to Britain. But I think it's important that we do ensure that actually this is a conversation for everybody in Britain, because, I've been doing interviews for the media about the book, and, I'll get these kind of very softly apologetic introductory notes, and they'll say, well, I don't really know much about the British Empire, and it hasn't really affected me. And they'll be from Manchester, and I'm like, you do know Manchester used to be Cottonopolis. That's where you had the rise of the factories, the Industrial Revolution, the squalor that people lived in, and the escape from the countryside. You do know, somebody say, well, but I did have a grandfather from Scotland and an uncle from Wales. I'm like, well, Scotland had its own history of the British Empire, and Wales and Northern Ireland were obviously, part of that colonial enterprise. If you lived in Bristol, like the MP, she's actually from Bristol, which was a slave trading port. That's how Bristol became rich. And Liverpool, and we have the communities of the Lascars and the sailors in Cardiff and in the Docklands. Everybody in Britain has a story. And I think one of the great fallacies of this is that it's somehow only for people from the colonized countries, and that it's our problem to solve it, when actually it's a conversation that everybody needs to have. And the reason I thought of it is, Black History Month is so important. We've just had a South Asian Heritage Month, but Black history is also white history, and South Asian heritage is also white heritage, because you can't have one story without the other. And it's so important that we make that point when we're talking about these bigger stories, that everybody's in it. It's not just, how did it affect us?
You were talking about child labour. I just wanted to ask, is child labour banned in every country? And if not, why is it only that specific countries don't allow this and others might?
I have to be honest, that is quite a big question. And I am not a child labour expert globally. I'm not quite sure how to answer that. I think it's a good question. I think there are different ages in different countries, but I wouldn't like to kind of confirm that right now. I don't know the answer, but I think what we can learn from that in the UK, we can thank those children for speaking up for the beginnings of the child labour laws we have here.
Thank you.
These children are a tough crowd, I tell you.
Ali. Yeah.
Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam.
Thank you for your interesting talk. I just had a question about your writing process. So how did you find writing a children's book, given your earlier books were aimed at adults?
So, for those who don't know my writing background, I've written 2 books for adults. I write newspaper columns, and then this is my 3rd children's book. I will tell you that writing for children is the hardest thing you will ever do. Because you have to, particularly if you're talking about, the British Empire is 400 years across the whole global expanse in lots of different countries where lots of things happen, and to turn that into a point of view with a narrative thread in simple, easy to understand language in a limited word count, hardest thing I've ever done, absolutely, hands down. Writing for adults is difficult, but typically you can use complicated, flowery language, and typically you can use as many words as you like. So actually I find writing for children is much, much tougher, but makes your writing much better. So yeah, I think I might have cried a few times when I wrote it.
Thank you very much. Okay.
With regards to writing for children, are we looking forward to any future titles from yourself that might be inspiring the next generations?
I've written 2 in 15 months, so I think I'm probably due a little bit of a break. But if you have ideas of what you would like to see, then I'm always open to those. I mean, my writing for children is really to help, to give them tools to understand the world we live in. I'm very interested in how they can understand the systems that structure how we think and be able to decode them for themselves. So my last book was around beauty and girls, and how to give girls the tools to understand how our ideas of womanhood and beauty are shaped, and how to spot how the system works. And really writing about the British Empire is the same thing. It's about how does the world operate, why does it operate in the way it does, and why do we have wealth and inequality and the global distribution. I mean, you can't write this in a children's book, but this is what the book is about, really. So that's what really interests me, is like, how does the world work and how do we help children to understand that?
Thank you so much, Shelina. I know there probably are other questions, but we do have to end there. So thank you very much. Salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad.